see you guys in the dark.
When I lived in Tucson, I rented a home in a retirement community. I had a Harley Davidson and was living with my dog. A neighbor had a motorcycle as well, but was too old to ride and would stand outside and wave when I would arrive by and take off. He lived just across from me. The neighbor next to him said he was a really nice guy and could use a friend and someone to help out from time to time with things, seeing as how he was older and I was in my early 30s. One day I'm on my ladder, cutting branches on my mesquite tree. He asked if I could swing by afterwards and cut a few of his branches as well. I gladly said yes. We got to chatting, and his wife of nearly 70 years had passed away about 5 years prior. He said he'd been sad and lonely without her. He also told me that he was a teacher for many years before retiring. As we parted ways, he asked if I could come by sometime, help him plug in a Blu-ray player he had purchased. I told him that was no problem. I came by to help install the Blu-ray player a few days later. He was making something to eat. He asked if I wanted to have a bite, and if I was into whiskey. I told him that I was an avid Jameson drinker, in my 20s, so he poured me some whiskey on the rocks. As we had some Bertolli pasta before hooking up the Blu-ray player behind his TV, that was hard to get to in an odd entertainment center. He asked me, "Do you like wrestling? I have a good friend that lives near the base of Mount Lemon. He's about my age. Sometimes we have some of the younger guys over there, and he has his mats in the house. Everyone takes off their shirts and pants and then wrestles. It's a lot of fun." What the fuck? I told him that's not something that I'm interested in. I became extremely uncomfortable. I decided to very quickly hook up the Blu-ray player so that I could go home immediately. As I'm behind the TV and can't see him, he starts asking me if I enjoy watching pornography, that he has pornography videos on DVD that he can share with me. I almost smashed my head into the top of the entertainment center just as I was plugging in the HDMI cable. He was asking me such bizarre questions. As quickly as humanly possible, I got out from behind the TV so that I could see him and ensure I was safe from anything happening. Thankfully, he was just standing behind the couch, 15 feet away, watching while I finished. I told him that I'm not into that kind of thing. I've got to go. I quickly made a dash for the door and told him goodbye. From that point forward, I never interacted with him. My damn motorcycle was very loud, so every time I'd leave, which was often, he would hear it, come outside and watch while I rode off waving at me. When I'd come home later in the evenings, I could see in his front window where his computer and monitor were. I swore that there were videos of women playing on his monitor with his blinds wide open while he sat there. I never stopped long enough to see the specifics about what he was watching. Considering that he was a teacher in his former life in Minnesota, his completely bizarre and disgusting questions really frightened me about whether or not he might be involved with younger people in the past. This was years ago. These memories still freak me out these days when I think about it. So I'm a female, and this happened when I was around 12. First, some backstory. I have had this neighbor that lived a street down from me. For a couple of months, he lived with his dad because he couldn't afford his own place. No problem, yet. Until he started staring, peeking, and looking into the windows of houses. The horrifying part is no one knew why. Probably to look at naked women, but he's been caught many times. The police have been called on multiple times, and he has been arrested a handful of times for smaller problems. Well, while this was going on, rumors spread that he was lurking around the neighborhood, so parents became hesitant to let their kids play outside. Now one day, I met him face to face. I was walking home from my grandparents' house. They lived a short walking distance away from my younger brother, who was 10. We walk and talk about how the day was going while my mom drove home before us. We didn't want to drive in the car, we just wanted to walk. So we are walking home. It was close to a 5-minute walk back to my house. Once we finally turned the corner to our small cul-de-sac, we see the man's car drive by. The whole neighborhood was on watch for him. I whispered to my brother, "That's..." He says, "No way, really?" And him being the smart, invincible 10-year-old that he was, yells, "Yo!" to this moving car with the window down. Not thinking he really heard us, I gave him a stern smack on the head, told him to just keep walking. Meanwhile, the man turns his car around and starts to follow us. I finally notice in disbelief and scream, "Run!" And we run to my mother's arms. She was waiting for us in the garage, not noticing what happened. The man does a loop in his car in the cul-de-sac and leaves going the way that he came. He now knew where we lived. That night we all huddled nervously, thinking that he was lurking around the home. He never came, as we knew of. 2 weeks later, he was arrested for showing his male parts to a woman in Walmart. He was arrested for a year and is now back in the neighborhood, selling drugs. Many rumors have spread that he lured many underage girls to his house, but no one knows if that was true or not. So that's where I sit today, wondering, always wondering what happened to him, and always looking over my shoulder. For most of my childhood, my family and I lived one house away from a pedophile. For the sake of this story, I'll call him Mr. Stan. Our old neighborhood started at the top of a hill and went down to a small lake where the road turned right and branched off into a cul-de-sac and another residential road. Mr. Stan's house was at the top of the hill, and ours was in the middle. Mr. Stan lived in the neighborhood long before we moved in. It's hard for me to remember any vivid details about him, as I was very young at the time. But what I do remember is that every time he saw us, his face would scrunch up as if he smelled something terrible. There was one house between his place and ours, something that I am very grateful for. And I don't know what life would have been like if we had to live right next to him. Right from when we were little, my parents were very strict about walking past Mr. Stan's house. They told us that Mr. Stan was sick in the head, and if he ever asked us to come into his house, we were never, ever allowed to do so by ourselves. For years, no one told us exactly why Mr. Stan was bad, but we didn't need any details. We just knew how to avoid him. The look he gave us whenever he was working on his car or planting flowers in his garden was enough. When my sister and I would walk up the hill to school, we would cross the street. We'd get to his place just to be safe. Like I said, I don't remember very much about him, and his twisted story begins long before I was even born. For this, I turned to my mom to fill in the details. Mom said that before we ever moved into the cul-de-sac, around the late 70s, early 80s, Mr. Stan already had the reputation of being a heavy drinker. He would get drunk and go over to the house of the family right across the street from us to do terrible things to the daughter while she was babysitting. The daughter tried to tell her mother about it, but since she was a rebellious child, her mother didn't believe her. Her family and Mr. Stan's family were actually good friends. Mr. Stan worked as a corrections officer, and soon accusations surfaced that Mr. Stan and another officer regularly did things to their co-workers' kids. Mr. Stan was able to avoid conviction by ratting out to the other officer, but in the process, he lost his job. As far as I know, he never really worked after that. Mr. Stan had 2 daughters of his own, and while the older one claimed that she was molested and suffered from mental problems as a result, the younger one said that she was never mistreated in any way, and grew up to be a very positive person. Mr. Stan's wife stood by her husband and claimed that he was innocent throughout the whole ordeal. Ironically, the older daughter's emotional instability resulted in her child going to live with Grandpa. When my family moved into our house in the cul-de-sac, our next-door neighbor, a kind but nosy old man, told my dad to keep my sister and I away from Mr. Stan. He told my parents the gossip and his story about the children, which understandably horrified them both. As a result, my mom and dad were wary of him from the start. Mr. Stan was cordial enough. He would say hello to my family and all that neighborly stuff. According to Mom, he even offered to babysit my little sister and I, to which my parents politely, but they declined. Sometime around 2002, my dad was going to work when he came across a neighborhood kid, let's call her Lana, on her way up to the street. My dad is a chatty person, so he asked Lana what she was up to. She told him that she was going to see Mr. Stan at his house and give him a back rub. Dad knew that something was off, so he told Lana's parents. To his surprise, they weren't alarmed at all, and said that sort of thing happened all the time. According to Mom, when Lana was older, Dad asked her if Mr. Stan ever acted inappropriately towards her during those visits, and her answer was definitely. When my sister was in kindergarten and I was in third grade, Mr. Stan's grandkids came to live with him and his wife for reasons I mentioned earlier. My parents couldn't believe that this was allowed by anyone, especially considering the allegations and neighborhood gossip around Mr. Stan. His granddaughter was in the same kindergarten class as my sister, and his grandson was about my age. Mom told me that it was so disturbing to see the sweet little granddaughter at school every day and know what was probably going on behind closed doors. My parents always have had strong morals, particularly my dad. They would often talk about what they should do. They wanted to report him to the authorities before any harm could come to his grandchildren. Mom and Dad knew that if they reported Mr. Stan, they'd be putting themselves at risk, and the rest of the neighborhood was no help. Mom said it was as if they were all hiding under rocks and turning a blind eye to what was happening. In the end, my parents' strong morality won, and they decided, with the risk of being exposed as whistleblowers, to report Mr. Stan to the principal at the elementary school. The principal, in turn, called the minister, sent people to Mr. Stan's house for home visits and investigations. In the end, it was decided that the grandchildren would be removed from Mr. Stan's house. Mom isn't sure how it happened, but somehow it leaked that my parents were the ones who reported Mr. Stan as a child molester. She thinks Lana's family had a hand in it. And as Mom put it, that's when the real fun began. Mr. Stan was no longer friendly towards my family. No more waves, no more chit-chat. Instead, he would target my mom with his car if she was walking down the road, or scream obscenities at my dad as he went to work. A few times he crossed the center line to scare us if we passed each other while driving. He told my dad that he ruined his life, and that he was a horrible person. Thinking about that now really boils my blood, because my dad is one of the kindest and most considerate men that I know. Mom was miserable and wanted to move. But Dad, as unshakable as he is, said he wasn't in any hurry. Mom told me it took 3 years of house hunting before she finally convinced Dad that it was time to go. Only after all of this, when we had been living in our beautiful new home out in the country, did I finally start to uncover the details of this story. But sadly, it really doesn't end there. After we moved out, Lana and the other girls, who were now grown up, came forward to report Mr. Stan and what he had done. He was hauled into court for a second time, and this time there was no one that could rat on to save himself. The testimony against him was building up. My parents followed the trial in the newspaper. They wanted to see him put away for all the terrible things that he has done. I have no memory of these proceedings, of course, and nobody wanted to explain it to me. I really don't blame them. Mr. Stan was not only a former corrections officer, but now he was also a convicted pedo. He knew that he would not last long if he went to prison, so on a quiet morning 1 week before his sentencing, Mr. Stan took a hunting rifle and shot himself. The folks who moved into Lana's house after her family left were walking their kids to school when they heard the shot. Mom tells me the image of that scene haunts her to this day. I think she imagines what it would have been like if it were her walking my sister and I to school in place of that other family. Or maybe she was disturbed to learn that Mr. Stan had a gun. I know it sounds pretty harsh, but I'm glad that he's gone. He can never hurt another child again. My memories of this whole ordeal are far less interesting than the actual events, but one thing I do remember very clearly is being afraid of Mr. Stan's house. I knew that it was dangerous. In my memory, it was painted black with white stucco. The car park and stairs to the front door were all underneath the wood roof, which cast the entire front of the house into shadow. To me, it was a monster house, though I didn't know why. My sister and I only ever went to Mr. Stan's front door once. It was Halloween, and my parents decided that it was okay for us to trick-or-treat at his house, since they would be standing at the bottom of the stairs. I was actually very reluctant to go, and my parents had to encourage me that it was okay. Mr. Stan's house was the only one that didn't need Halloween decorations to be scary. So my sister and I cautiously climbed the stairs and rang the doorbell. His wife opened up the door. She was kind to us and gave us candy. I remember being surprised that Mr. Stan's wife was so nice, but I remembered most of what I wanted to see inside the forbidden house. For some reason, this was still stuck with me. I looked behind Mrs. Stan, and there was Mr. Stan in a wife-beater top, beer belly, and all, sitting in an armchair watching TV. It was dim in the living room except for a lamp and the glow of the TV. Mr. Stan didn't look at us. For years I wondered if that was what bad men really looked like. When I think about this story now, 11 years later, it really hits me how dark my neighborhood was under the surface. It's quite disturbing to me, because my childhood was actually quite happy. I was too young to notice anything wrong. I couldn't sense the tension that my parents lived with every day. I didn't know how much potential danger my sister and I were in. All I knew was that it was a beautiful day to play with my marbles and go to the lake. But now that I think of it, Mr. Stan may have been the reason that my parents bought a copy of You Can Say No, a picture book that teaches children about safety around bad people. I think my parents handled the situation very well, and I'm so thankful that they were attentive and brave during the whole thing. The story could have gone very differently, but I think about our old house on the cul-de-sac. It's usually the happy memories that I think of first. Mom tells me that despite of all the trouble they went through, neither she or my dad regret the decisions that they made. And she left me with one last ominous message. They say that every neighborhood has a pedophile living there. Most of the time, we just don't know about it. This incident is tough enough for me to talk about. I'm a 27-year-old male and living in New Hampshire at the time, in an extremely safe town. I lived alone with my dog Toby during this time and worked 6 a.m. to 3 p.m. Sharing a duplex was new to me and quite different, especially when your neighbors were very odd. It was a lady in her 60s and a younger man in his 30s. I believed that they were mother-son because they wouldn't speak to me. I had no clue. I was making small talk, but neither of them said a word to me. The mother looked beat down with gray hair, and she wore the same nightgown every single time I saw her. I would see the son smoking outside, wearing the same white wife beater since I moved in 7 months prior. It was a summer night in July, around 11 p.m. I let Toby out into the backyard. Now, mind you, I share a backyard with these creeps. Toby was running around, and I heard the neighbor slide open the door. I saw the younger man and his wife beater walk out into this deck. Gave me a death stare. My heart dropped, and I began feeling extremely anxious. I saw him reach into his pocket and pull out a gun. He pointed it at Toby, fired 4 times. I screamed louder than I ever have in my life. The man ran inside and closed his door. I began sprinting towards Toby, but he fled into the woods. I immediately called 911 and told them what happened. The police arrived in 5 minutes and surrounded our duplex. They placed me in the police car and asked me to recount what happened. My dog Toby never barked and was the most behaved puppy you'll ever see, so he had no excuse to shoot him. The cops were outside about 15 minutes until they heard 3 gunshots. They rushed inside and found the mother and son deceased, both by bullet wounds. Come to find later, the son had shot his mother twice, and then committed suicide with a single shot to his head. Later that night, Toby came back and was shot in his back leg. After a couple surgeries, he came back brand new. This was the most horrific thing that I have ever witnessed, and I am definitely blessed that I have my dog still. So this happened in 2013. This kid named Ricky moved in next door to me when he was around 12. And for lack of a better term, this kid was pretty much a pussy. I remember one time he fell on his skateboard and didn't land hard at all. Was crying his little heart out in the driveway when he was like 16. Fast forward when this kid was like 18. By then I'm selling coke and Molly pretty heavy, and he's one of my best customers. Now he's hanging with some pretty shady people, which my parents obviously aren't fans of. My parents also didn't know I was ever selling anything because I was pretty good at keeping it under the wraps. Ricky was clearly a follower. He went from the skater/emo type to wannabe thug, which he wasn't built for. So my parents go to Outer Banks, North Carolina, every year for about 2 weeks, and ask if I'll come stay at the house while they are gone, which I was excited about because their house is much better than the shitty little 1-bedroom apartment that I was at the time. Everything was going fine at the house. I had my on and off again girlfriend over all the time, and there was quite a bit of drugs and alcohol going on. I was far from a saint back then. I'll never forget it. It was a Thursday night. My girl had left just a few hours ago. I should say earlier that day, Ricky had sent me out in front of my parents' house and asked for a front. I told him no, considering I never fronted anyone, and in all honesty, had been using too much of my own shit, so I couldn't afford to. He didn't like that very much, and we got into an argument. I pretty much punked him in front of all of his little friends. So by now it's like 2 in the morning. I'm obviously nowhere near tired because of all the coke and Molly. I'm sitting in the dark, watching Netflix in this den side living room my parents had in the downstairs, which has a window going outside, which I had decided to open up. I had paused the TV and was on my phone texting, on Facebook when I hear something. It's the screen of my window slowly being slid up. I know the sound. I had snuck in and out of this house numerous times growing up. So I slowly get up, watch the window. I clearly see the screen moving very slowly up through the curtains. I walk up to the window, and as soon as I move the curtain, 3 or 4 people scatter. I run out, but they are booking it down the street. I knew it was that Ricky kid and his friends. I didn't see them, but I knew that it was those shitheads. I didn't call the cops or nothing, because I wasn't exactly living on the right side of the law. So I just go back in, lock everything up, and the rest of the week goes pretty smooth. I never told my parents about it, and I also never seen Ricky again. Called him a few times, which he never answered, which was all the more reason to know that it was him, and he knew that I knew. So like a month goes by, I'm watching the news, and Ricky is on it for murder, which blows my mind. Him and 3 of his friends went out of town, broke into some old couple's home, beat them, tied them up, and then stabbed them. Then they burned the house down after robbing it. They all ended up telling on each other. He got sentenced to 35 years for testifying against his co-defendants. Makes me wonder what would have happened if I was asleep when they got in. What would have happened? I'm just glad that I happened to have been up at that night and heard that sliding door trying to open.
If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe, like, and hit the bell for notifications on future videos and become a stalker of the night. And I'll see you next time.